The young and the restless spoiler's shock, it all happened in a blink, but the pain lingered like fire. Nick's hands clutched his side, blood warm and thick between his fingers, his breathing erratic as the world swam out of focus. The blade had come swiftly, almost silently, delivered by a masked figure who moved with terrifying intent. At first, Nick had thought it was just another one of Kane's henchmen, a nameless brute sent to finish what they had begun by holding him and Sharon hostage. But something was wrong. Something was off. There was a hesitation in the man's movements, a flicker of recognition, a misstep that allowed Nick to fight back. Fueled by raw instinct and the desperate will to survive, Nick twisted and grabbed the attacker's arm, pushing with all his remaining strength. The two men struggled, rolling across the cold tile, until Nick reached for the mask, just a corner at first, a frayed edge tugged loose in the scuffle. But it was enough. The mask shifted. A glimpse of skin. A curl of hair. A familiar jawline. And then, a sound, a voice, just a grunt of pain, but it struck Nick harder than the knife had. It was a voice he had heard before. Not recently, but long ago, buried under years of silence and estrangement. He yanked harder, and the mask tore, sliding off to reveal a partial face, half lit by the flickering hall light. The attacker scrambled to cover himself again, but Nick had already seen enough. Not a stranger. Not some hired hand. But someone connected to him by blood, by tragedy, by history. A square jaw. Wild curls matted to a forehead slick with sweat. Eyes that burned, not with greed, not with survival, but with rage. And beneath that rage, something deeper. Resentment. Grief. A quiet fury years in the making. In that moment, even in agony, Nick knew. He had no proof, no logic to back it up. Only a voice inside him whispering the impossible. It's Reed. Reed Hellstrom. The once quiet, artistic son of Victoria and JT. The boy who had disappeared from Genoa City after a painful stretch of family implosion, after witnessing the collapse of everything he had been taught to believe in. Reed, who had once looked up to JT with hero-worshipping eyes, and then watched the man crumble, vilified by the Newman dynasty, driven to the brink by manipulation, betrayal, and madness. Reed, who had stood in courtrooms and living rooms, trying to make sense of a family legacy that made no sense at all. Reed, who had vanished one day, telling his mother he needed time. Space. Reed, who had promised quietly, I'll be back one day. And you'll understand why. Nick blinked, nearly blacking out from the pain, but the face hovered there still, half covered, half exposed. The attacker snarled, yanked the mask down again, and ran. But Nick had seen enough. The wound in his side was bleeding heavily, but the wound inside him was worse. This was family. And not just family. This was vengeance, born and nurtured under the weight of their own legacy. As Sharon and Sally found him moments later, desperately trying to stop the bleeding, Nick could barely speak. He clutched Sharon's arm, eyes wild, and whispered only a name, Reed. Sharon froze, her expression twisting from panic to confusion, and then fear. She hadn't heard that name in years. Neither had Sally. But Nick's voice was hoarse and certain. He had seen what he had seen. And it shook him more than the stabbing itself. In the hours that followed, while the blood loss threatened to take Nick into unconsciousness, the truth began to settle in his mind. It explained everything, the calculated silence, the stealth, the sudden spike of violence without warning. Reed wasn't just trying to scare them. He was trying to make a statement. One written in blood. And the target had been Nick from the beginning. Because Reed hadn't forgotten what had happened to JT. The stories, the headlines, the accusations. The day Victoria had chosen to believe that JT was dangerous. The day the Newmans, Nick included, rallied against him, spun the narrative, and left him broken. Yes, JT had made his mistakes. He had spiraled. But Reed had never believed he was beyond redemption. And in his eyes, the Newmans hadn't just abandoned JT. They had destroyed him. Reed had watched it all, too young to fight it, too old to forget. He had seen how his family circled the wagons, controlled the press, and pushed JT into a corner so deep he never really came back. Reed had watched his mother suffer, yes, but he had also watched JT vanish from her heart like a bad dream. And he couldn't forgive that. So he left. But he didn't disappear. He trained. He traveled. He carried that anger across continents. And now, the anger had grown teeth. Reed had returned not to talk, not to reconcile, but to destroy. Quietly. From the inside. The way the Newmans had once destroyed his father. Back at the estate, Kane had heard about the stabbing and moved quickly to spin it. He claimed a random intruder had attacked Nick. No one knew how the man had gotten past security, but it didn't matter. Carter nodded, too quickly, and repeated the story. But Sharon wasn't buying it. Neither was Sally. Especially not after what Nick had whispered. Reed. The name kept circling, unanswered. Unacknowledged. But it was real. It was possible. And that made it terrifying. Sharon began to investigate, quietly and carefully. She asked questions about who had access to the mountain. Who had come in the last few days. Who had been seen but not identified. The staff said nothing, but their eyes darted. The mountain had many secrets, and one of them had just tried to kill Nick Newman. Meanwhile, Nick refused to rest. Even as the pain flared through his side, even as Sally begged him to stay still, he kept asking questions, kept turning the memory over and over in his head. The voice. The eyes. The hesitation. Reed hadn't wanted to kill him, at least not at first. There had been a moment of doubt. A moment of recognition. And then it had turned to fury. Which meant there was still a crack in the mask. Still a way to reach him. But what would happen if Reed came again? What if next time, he didn't hesitate? Kane watched the family unravel with a strange satisfaction. He didn't know the identity of the attacker, but he knew what chaos looked like, and he liked it. Nick weakened. Sharon on edge. Sally furious. The mountain holding them hostage not just physically, but emotionally. And if someone else wanted to do his dirty work for him, well, he wasn't going to stop them. But Reed wasn't working for Kane. He wasn't working for anyone. He was a ghost, walking among the living, carrying the burden of a ruined father and a mother who had rewritten the story. And this was just the beginning. Because now, Nick knew. And the Newmans would soon learn that some family wounds don't heal with time. They fester. They return. And they come with a knife. The blood came in waves, thick, warm, relentless. Nick could barely sit upright, his hands slick with it, pressing hard against the gaping wound at his side, his breath sharp and uneven. He leaned against the cold stone wall of the hallway as the air thinned around him, every heartbeat pulsing louder in his ears. And across from him, standing in the shadows with his chest rising and falling, the blade still faintly glinting in his hand, was Reed Hellstrom. His face no longer hidden, the mask torn off in the chaos of struggle, revealing not just his identity, but a fury that had been simmering for years. The boy who had once played guitar in quiet corners, who had once called Nick uncle, now stood as a man transformed, no longer grieving, but burning. Nick struggled to speak, to make sense of it, the question clawing at his throat even as blood gurgled in his lungs. "Why?" he whispered, barely audible. "Reed, why?" And Reed didn't flinch. His voice was flat, but not cold. It carried the weight of decades he never got to live properly. "Because someone had to make you understand," he said. "You all treated my father like garbage. You dragged him through the dirt. You took everything from him. You made him out to be the villain. And everyone just moved on. Like it didn't matter. Like he didn't matter. Nick's vision blurred as he clung to consciousness. Damien, why Damien? Reed's jaw tightened. Damien was a pawn. An arrogant, mouthy pawn. He suspected too much. He poked around where he shouldn't. He was going to expose the truth, make noise, threaten what I've been building. I couldn't let him get in the way. No one mourns a man they barely knew. You killed him, Nick coughed, blood painting his lips. You killed Damien? Reed nodded without shame. Yes. And I don't regret it. That was just the beginning. For every time your family broke mine, I'm going to return it double. Tenfold. You think I'm the villain? You're wrong. I'm the reckoning. You want to talk about justice? Talk to my dad. Or what's left of him. Nick tried to pull himself up, but his muscles betrayed him. His body was failing fast, the blood loss dragging him toward unconsciousness. He reached out, one last time, to try and speak, to reason with Reed, to say that JT's legacy didn't need to be rewritten in violence. But before he could form the words, Reed stepped back. His face barely lit. Held something Nick couldn't quite read. Was it guilt? Doubt? Or just the weight of knowing his identity had been exposed? In a flash, Reed reached down, grabbed the torn mask, and pulled it back over his face. His curls tucked beneath the dark cloth, his jaw hidden once more, his voice once again faceless. I didn't want you to know it was me, he said. But maybe it's better this way. Maybe now, you'll finally understand what you've done to us. And then, he was gone. A blur into the dark corridors of Kane Ashby's estate, vanishing like smoke into the night. By the time Sally and Sharon found Nick moments later, Reed had disappeared into the trees surrounding the property, leaving behind only a pool of blood, a broken man, and a name whispered into the wind. The emergency was immediate. Sally screamed for help while Sharon tried desperately to stem the bleeding. Carter, stunned by the noise, arrived too late to be useful and too afraid to lie. No one said Reed's name aloud, not yet. Not until Nick regained enough breath to whisper it again, this time with tears in his eyes. Sharon froze. Sally stared in disbelief. Reed, she repeated, as if saying it aloud might make it untrue. But Nick, pale and shivering, nodded once. The news moved quickly. And the implications hit harder than any blade. Victoria's son, her son, had returned from exile, not for healing or redemption, but for revenge. And now, not only had he nearly killed Nick, but he had also confessed to murdering Damien, whose death had rocked Genoa City weeks earlier. The image of Reed as a gentle, misunderstood boy was obliterated in an instant. In his place stood a calculated, ideological assassin, a young man so twisted by grief and rage that he saw justice only through the scope of blood. When the police were finally called, first responders delayed by the mountain terrain and limited access. The manhunt began immediately. Chance Chancellor, already strained by the circumstances around Kane's secretive retreat and the growing list of suspicious incidents, launched the investigation himself. But even Chance knew they were already behind. Reed had planned this for years. He knew how to disappear. And now that his face had been exposed, his methods would only become more dangerous. A statewide bulletin was issued. Helicopters scanned the ridgelines. But Reed had vanished, likely taking one of Kane's untraceable emergency routes down the mountain. No footprints. No signal. No trace. Only his name. Only the memory of what he'd done. Victoria, upon hearing the truth, collapsed into sobs that were half fury, half devastation. She had always worried this day might come. That the rage her son bottled inside might one day spill out. She had tried to keep him grounded. She had tried to protect him from JT's legacy, from the pain of what happened between her and his father. But she had failed. And now, someone was dead. Another gravely injured. And her son was out there, hunted. Victor said nothing. His face was stone. But his mind was racing. This was not just a personal tragedy now. This was a public scandal. Another stain on the Newman name. And worse, another war from within. Meanwhile, Nick remained in critical condition. The knife had pierced muscle but missed major arteries. He was lucky, but not lucky enough to forget. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Reed's face. Not just the man he had become, but the boy he had been. That memory hurt even more than the wound. Because somewhere inside, Nick still believed there was good in him. That Reed could be reached. But now, that belief was fading. Now, Reed was a fugitive. A confessed killer. And Nick had no idea where he would strike next. Was Reed working alone? Or were there others feeding his ideology? Was JT really as far gone as everyone believed? Or had his son inherited more than just his voice and face? The mountain had been a trap from the beginning. Not just a physical one, but emotional. Now it had exploded. Damien's murder was no longer a mystery, it was a message. And Nick, despite surviving, had been the proof of that message written in blood. And Reed, he was still out there. Somewhere. Watching. Planning. And he had only just begun. Would you like the next part to focus on Victoria confronting the truth, chance tracking Red across Europe, or a shocking scene where Reed contacts someone from the Newman family again, this time with a new demand or threat? I can continue expanding this into a full-blown revenge arc or redemption twist.